Good evening, everybody, and welcome. And my name is Michaela, and I'm president of the Sisterhood. And I'm thrilled tonight to be with the very talented Jacqueline. And if you were lucky enough to join us last month, you would have had a sneak peek at Jacqueline's art when we did the cooking with Shauna and Jacqueline. So welcome, Jacqueline. Thank you for joining us. And I have to say, I'm a huge fan of your paintings. I find there's something very comforting and comfortable about your paintings. It's like flipping through a photo album, and you can really sense all that emotion and memories that come out of your paintings. So I'm very excited tonight to hear what you have to say. Jacqueline was not born in Montreal, but she has very close connections to Montreal and the Hashomayim. And we'll look forward to hearing you tell us your story through your art. And if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the chat and we'll get to them when Jacqueline's finished talking. So I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Michaela. So tonight, I just want to thank, of course, my dear friend, Shauna Goodmanson, who is asleep right now in Israel, but she introduced me to you, which I'm thrilled about. And I also want to thank the Shaar Sisterhood for inviting me to speak to you tonight. Tonight, I also would like to acknowledge my late cousin, Lily Azulay Schwartz. As you know, she was a past president of the Shaar Sisterhood. She passed away only just in December, and it is poignant that today would have been her 70th birthday. So there are many members of her family on this call right now, and it's really meaningful that we're able to be here together, particularly today. So what a lucky, I guess, date that was chosen for us to be together. I have wanted to share my art with the Montreal Jewish community for a very long time. I have such warm feelings of gratitude and connection for a city that I've never even personally lived in. And I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to tell you why. So just bear with me as I do this. And hang on, let me make this a nice full size. Okay. One second. Just that way. Okay. Here's why I feel connected to Montreal. First of all, after the Holocaust, my parents and extended family immigrated to Montreal, living in and around Jean Man Street. And I'm saying Jean Man Street wrong, because that's how everybody said it. I know you're supposed to say it as Jean Mons, but you'll bear with me. My Zadie Henry sang in the Hashomayim men's choir. My mom studied at Strathcona High School and later with Arthur Lismer of the Canadian Group of Seven, who offered her an opportunity to study with him at the Montreal Museum of Fine Art, but instead she chose marriage and family instead, marrying my father, who she met at the corner of Bleury and St. Catherine Street. My father also arrived in Montreal after the Holocaust as a refugee. He worked in the garment factories, but also managed to graduate from Sir George William University before moving to Toronto with my mom to study at Osgoode Hall Law School. Driving east on 401 from Toronto to Montreal to visit cousins and grandparents was a very much beloved trip. And if you had asked 8-year-old me my recommendation for the finest and most luxurious hotel to stay in the entire world, I would have absolutely said Hotel Ruby Foods. And here you can see just this funny little painting that I made a few years ago of myself on the diving board. And for the record, I am partial to the Montreal bagel. So lots of reasons to love Montreal. And I'm going to get right into this presentation, which is called, just bear with me, hang on. Hello, why isn't this behaving? I just want to get my mouse to behave. It is not behaving. No, this is my limited Yiddish. Oh, there it is. Okay, my mouse is now behaving. Okay, here we go. My presentation is called, why is this not working? Hang on, just bear with me here. I'm having some technical difficulties that I can't fully explain. Oh, reload. It's big again. And I'm going to just hang in there. I'm so sorry this is acting weird. It's never done this before, but hopefully it'll stop. Slideshow. And there we go. Growing up Jewish, art and storytelling. Live shows are always, anything can happen. So here we are. My presentation is called Growing Up Jewish, Art and Storytelling. So what I'm going to show you today is a deeply personal series of paintings and stories I created to simply look at who and what shaped my North American brand of Jewish identity and what happens to Judaism as it transmits from one generation to the next. This series is called Growing Up Jewish, Art and Storytelling. I created it because I wanted to tell my family's North American Jewish story and perhaps shine a fresh new light on what Judaic art could look like. I'm going to start my presentation today by telling you a little bit about me and how I became inspired to create this series and how I ultimately found myself very unexpectedly and unintentionally in the role of uncovering, honoring, and sharing my family's Holocaust story through really all 40 of these paintings and stories, which are based on 5 generations worth of vintage family photos. And a note before I even go into this presentation. When I conceived of this project, I only wanted to look at Jewish identity. I didn't actually want to look at the Holocaust, but as time wore on and as I dug deeper into this and interviewed my mom, which is where I got most of my stories about Jewish identity in our family, I realized that so much of how I participate in Jewish life, how I identify as a Jewish person, as a North American Jew, is shaped by the fact that I came from a member from the second generation, from the fact that my parents and grandparents survived the Holocaust. And so before I came to this presentation tonight for the Montreal group, I debated, should I only stick to the Jewish identity piece, or should I give you this presentation from this perspective of what it meant to grow up as a member of the second generation? And I decided that because so many of my family members and so many refugees arrived in Montreal, and so many early experiences with Jewish life happened during that time period following the Holocaust, I am going to do this with a little bit of a Holocaust bent in my presentation. So let's get going. So first, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about me. My life as an artist, it was obvious from an early age. In fact, every single report card that I received from Owen Public School in Toronto, where I grew up, said the same thing year after year. Jackie talks too much and she's good at art. As for my Jewish upbringing, I'll tell you this. In our comfortable Jewish-ish Toronto neighborhood, we were considered the big Jews. My parents, as you know, survived the Holocaust as children and spoke Yiddish when they didn't want us to understand something. They were the founding members of our conservative movement synagogue, which we attended every week. We kept Shabbat, we kept kosher, and we observed all the holidays. I liked it, mostly. I remember when I was in middle school, I was so embarrassed to be the only family with a sukkah in our backyard on display for everyone to see. We lived in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, but nobody built them. I thought it was way too Jewish, and I just wanted to be normal Jewish. It only recently occurred to me that the Jewish life we observed was informed in large part by the traditional brand of Judaism my parents brought with them from the old country after they immigrated in 1949. We were one of the only greener families in our neighborhood, which was largely populated by Canadian Jews. People whose families had been in Canada for generations already. I'm going to be exploring this idea a little bit more later on in the presentation. Today, not much has changed about me. I still talk a lot. I paint almost every day, and now in our comfortable Jewish-ish suburb of Highland Park, Illinois, we are considered the big Jews, at least by some anyway, which is funny to me. It's full circle. So given my connection and involvement in my Jewish community, I've often been asked, Jackie, why don't you paint Jewish art? It was a good and logical question, but I had no idea what I'd even paint. I paint figures in bathing suits. I like to draw inspiration from vintage family photos taken in summer by pools and at the beach, and then turn them into paintings. Judaism and art were two places where I felt very connected, but these were separate loves. Frankly, I resisted the thought of creating Judaic-themed art, and this is mostly because I had some very strong associations about what I thought Jewish art should look like, based on the Jewish-themed paintings that hung on the walls of my family home. Like this guy. This man, this Hasidic rabbi, presided over many episodes of The Love Boat and Fantasy Island in the TV room of my childhood home. To me, Jewish art fell into one of two categories. There were either limestone-hued scenes from Jerusalem or stern-faced, bearded rabbis of old, and there was no real connection here for me. To begin with, my rabbi had no beard and he wore turtlenecks. I had never seen a painting of Jewish summer camp, but that was where some of my most important formative Jewish experiences occurred. There was a strong disconnect for me between the Judaism I saw framed in paintings on the walls and my lived experiences on the ground. But the question vexed me. I wanted to challenge myself to figure out how I could create Judaic art in a way that felt truly authentic to the Judaism I grew up with. And then one day I was at my parents' house, going through their old photos, mining for something to paint, and I found a 1970s photo of my conservative movement rabbi. And then I found a lovely 1960s image of a Seder at my grandparents' house in Montreal. I had a flash of inspiration. What if I paint these images? 2 years later, I launched an exhibit entitled Growing Up Jewish Art and Storytelling. Based on 5 generations worth of vintage family photos, I was able to create 40 oil paintings and short narratives to tell my family's Jewish story. As I take you on this journey with me tonight, I very much want you to come away from this presentation seeing the fullness of Jewish life. Much like the famous verse from the Fiddler on the Roof song, Sunrise, Sunset, Jewish life is laden with happiness and tears. As such, you will see that many of the paintings in the Growing Up Jewish series are playful recollections of the Judaism of my youth. A great many of these paintings, however, will address my family's experiences during the Holocaust and its aftermath, and how these stories shaped my Jewish decisions both consciously and unconsciously. As I created this series, I spent a lot of time reflecting on what it meant for me to grow up in the shadow of the Holocaust as a member of the second generation. In all, I hope to give you a snapshot of North American Jewish life through 5 generations of one family that was devastated by the events of the Holocaust, that started over in Canada and rebuilt themselves and found their place in North America's vibrant Jewish communities. So I want to give you some context. As I mentioned, I'm a member of the second generation, a 2G. Both of my parents and their siblings, my grandparents, and a fair amount of my extended family lived through the horror of the Holocaust. My father hid in a forest with his family for 19 months. It was a terrible ordeal during which time my great-grandmother froze to death. It's a tiny detail, but my dad recounted in his memoir that she was wearing a red and white polka-dotted dress. My mother's family was in the Krakow ghetto, narrowly escaping certain death and Nazi firing squads by using false passports to survive. My mother's extended family was interned at Auschwitz, and some of them were saved by Oskar Schindler. All of my great-grandparents perished at the hands of the Nazis. For me, the generation that survived the Holocaust existed in living color, in their printed sundresses, socks, and sandals, with numbers tattooed on their arms. I grew up amongst people who were broken and haunted by their past, but who still managed to summon great love for my generation and indescribable gratitude for Canada, where they immigrated, and the triumph that my sisters, cousins, and I represented. These people were characters with huge personalities. Some were gentle and optimistic, some were hilarious, some were strong-willed, while others appeared to always live at the edge of anger or close to tears. All of them were permanently scarred to varying degrees by living in towns and cities where their neighbors and government turned their backs on them, betrayed them, persecuted, and murdered their parents, friends, and community, all for the crime of being born Jewish. So I'm going to take you into a slideshow. Hopefully this will behave. Hang on a sec. And just screen. Okay, here we go. So when I created this series, my interest was to look at Jewish identity as it evolved in North America. Truth be told, I deliberately tried to avoid the Holocaust when I started making these paintings. I wanted this series to be completely relatable no matter where you came from in the arc of the North American Jewish story. That every time I worked on a new image, whether it was my sister Caroline singing the 4 questions at Passover, or my parents' first trip to Israel, or my daughter's bat mitzvah celebration, my mind kept drifting back to the miracle of it all. None of us should be here. Hitler and the Nazis wanted my family and all of our future generations to be gone from the face of the earth. My Auntie Sylvia always used to say, "We are survivors." I never understood why she included me in that statement until now. As I created this painting series, I realized that my art provided a powerful vehicle to honor the memory of my family members who were murdered and whose lives were never spoken of again, and to tell the survival and rebuilding stories of my parents, grandparents, and extended family members. For example, nobody really knew or remembered Usher's story of how he survived a bicycle chain beating while protecting his brother. I only remembered him as the quiet, broken uncle who came alone to all of our birthday parties. As a member of the second generation, we are truly a unique subset of the Jewish community. We were used to living in homes where there were no old family photos, where broken English we straddled 2 worlds. We were equally comfortable in the homes of Greeners, where broken English was spoken in thick accents and expectations were high. Sometimes these homes felt really heavy and sad, especially if the survivors had whole lives before the war, including spouses and children who were taken from them. In Canada, these families were on round 2, starting over with replacement spouses and replacement children who felt the enormous burden of trying to make highly traumatized parents feel whole again. People who weren't necessarily compatible because of age differences, former social standing in the old country, or religious observance levels, married out of practical necessity or pure loneliness. We understood that too. It wasn't all dark though. My parents were so in love with each other and they appreciated how much they had achieved in Canada. Our home felt pretty free and fun, but we were used to seeing numbers tattooed on the soft skin of the arms that hugged us. We were loved beyond measure and knew that in their eyes, we were considered precious walking miracles on earth. There's nothing quite like the victory look a survivor gazes at his or her grandchild. Likewise, we loved visiting the seemingly carefree modern homes of our friends whose parents were born in North America and did things that were inconceivable to us, like eating everything on the menu at Chinese restaurants or going on family ski trips. When we were growing up, ripped jeans were in style, just like now, and I remember my Holocaust survivor relatives were nervous when we wore them. They worried that we had fallen on hard times again. As loved as we were, there were unspoken rules. Those of us who are 2Gs knew that our parents' generation had been through enough, and our job was to make sure that we did not disappoint them. All they wanted from us was Yiddish nachas, pride and joy. Of course, Yiddish nachas meant different things in different households. In some homes, it simply meant that all we had to do was walk in the room. In others, it meant that we should play the violin, go to law school, at least, go to shul, keep kosher, marry someone whose parents are Greeners, and don't name your babies without talking to us first, and don't get divorced, and on and on and on. It was the least we could do. As I reflected on my family, I marveled at them. I knew their stories of survival. It was the years following the Holocaust that really caught my attention. There were so many obstacles to overcome when they immigrated to Canada in 1949. How did these people arrive in North America with nothing, having endured the worst, and then manage to keep going and make a new life? Who was able to pull it off, and what motivated them? Who wasn't? What was the role of optimism in the rebuilding process? Was opportunity shared equally in these families? Who sacrificed so that others could advance? And what resentments did those left behind harbor inside of them? For many relatives, like my Zadie, the prime years of their lives happened during the Holocaust. By the time Zadie arrived in Canada, it was clear to him that real opportunity was reserved for younger generations and not himself. He had to accept the fact that his small schmata business was never going to amount to much. I also wondered, what was it like to reunite with family members who were safe in Canada during the war and who knew nothing of the suffering? Were these happy reunions or were they awkward? Survivor's guilt was rampant all around, not to mention the fact that families are complicated. I know that in mine, these reunions sparked the kind of anger that generated a lifetime of broigus, which is Yiddish for holding a grudge. It had something to do with my dad having to sweep the floor of our Canadian cousin's dress factory. Imagine the pride my survivor grandparents, who came from a village that looked like Anatevka, felt when my dad graduated from law school. Being snubbed by Canadian cousins really got under their skin. How did the existing Jewish community prepare to help these people whose material and emotional needs were so profound and overwhelming? From what I understood, the Canadian Jews were quite adept at providing for the material needs of the refugees, but socially and emotionally, there was a huge divide. Neither side wanted to talk about the horrors. This was not a generation that was used to talking about their feelings. The survivors created communities of their own, sticking together at local parks on their days off from work in the garment factories, hoping to find landsmen and grateful to be in the company of people who wordlessly understood them. Every success was monumental. What could be better than passing the high school matriculation exams and then getting a degree and attending law school after virtually missing a lifetime of education during the war years and time spent in the DP camps? How victorious was it to host a Pesach Seder and hear the Canadian grandchildren read the 4 questions at a large family gathering? Think about the satisfaction of being able to volunteer and give financial donations back to the community that supported them and gave them outfits to wear from a clothing bank. Can you imagine these people earning enough money to give tzedakah and spend winters in modest apartments in Florida or go on a vacation in the Catskills? Imagine how powerful it was for these people to visit the modern state of Israel, a place that might have saved so many if it had existed only 10 years earlier in the 1930s. That must have been very difficult for that generation to reconcile. You probably noted in this slideshow that there are images of Jewish life as observed by my generation and my children's generation, albeit somewhat different from the Judaism of the old country. Remember what Auntie Sylvia said? We, the second and third generations, are survivors too. I thought it was important to note that despite everything, the Jewish people continue. Am Yisrael Chai. As I painted these paintings and wrote these stories, I truly felt the awesome responsibility to make sure that my family's Holocaust stories, the ones that were so close to being relegated to the dustbins of history, were uncovered, recorded, and told. I'm so grateful to my dad for writing his memoir before he passed away, and my mom for recounting these Holocaust and Jewish stories for me. Okay, so let me stop this, just bear with me. And I'm going to escape. Go to the next slide. Full screen. Okay, all right, I got this. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is focus in on a few of the paintings from the collection and read their accompanying narratives to you. And the way I kind of imagined you experiencing this is kind of like what I used to love when I was a child, which was story time at the library. I want you to just get lost in the sound of my voice and lose yourself in the images if you wish, and just let your mind go along with the story like story time in the library. So what I'm going to do is focus on some of the early integration experiences of my family and what it was like to find their place within the established Jewish community. In these next few paintings and stories, I want to explore the social divide that existed between the Canadian Jews and the newly arrived refugees. In this slide, you're going to see a painting on the right by Fairfield Porter, who's an artist that I am inspired by. And on the left is a painting I created entitled Greeners, Galers, and Fairfield Porter, which is based off of a photo taken in 1950. Here's the story. I am most enamored with the paintings of Fairfield Porter. He was a Kennedy-era American artist who painted my fantasy of the good life. Genteel people of a certain lineage enjoying summer moments at his family's historic beach house in Maine, Awash in color, Porter captured images of generations reading together on the screen porch, friends gathered in conversation on sun-washed Adirondack chairs, morning tennis matches in preppy whites. As much as I idealize this world, I know that my people did not come from that stock or live like that. My mother-in-law once explained to me the Jewish social hierarchy as she experienced it. There were greeners and galers. She was a greener. I came from greeners. Galer is Yiddish for yellow, and greener, well, that's obvious. These terms are used as immigration and lineage metaphors. She explained that a galer is like a yellow vegetable that has had time to ripen on the vine, while a greener, like a green vegetable, is new on the vine. If you're a greener, it means that you're an immigrant from the old country and you have an accent. A galer is someone whose ancestors have been living in the New World for generations. Galers have ripened on the vine of America for a long time. Stereotypically, Galers have had time to build their fortunes in this country, become genteel, and take their place as part of the leisure class. They might sail or have beach homes. They play tennis. I love this image of my husband's grandparents. There they are, two greeners, as if planted into a Fairfield Porter painting, but just on the other side of the fence. It was a moment captured only a few short years after escaping the ravages of war. I love that they figured out how to insert themselves, if not in, then beside the leisure class of the Galers. They cast off their heavy clothes and the baggage of the past and had their day in the sun. So I showed these two paintings at my presentation back in December with Shauna, so I'm not going to read the stories that go with them again, but I did want to highlight the image on the left, which is my father seated in the grass in this group of Holocaust survivors who would meet regularly at Fletcher's Field, which was right across the street from what was the Jewish Immigrant Aid Services office back in those days. The newcomers, the refugees, would stick together. They wordlessly understood each other. This was a generation that maybe didn't go to therapy, even though they probably could have used it, but they relied on each other because they understood what they had been through and what life was like adjusting to Canada and all the dreams that they had for themselves and their futures while reconciling all the losses in their past. You know, truth is stranger than fiction. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting was the angelic-like faces of these two babies in the middle. These are, I guess, members of the second generation, possibly maybe born in DP camps and brought to Canada as immigrants. But children like those ones had so much pressure on them. They were miracle children. They were like the future. They were optimism. They were everything to these parents. And I just thought it was so interesting that it's as if they have halos around their head, but I swear I didn't make that up. It's exactly how the photo looked. And meanwhile, all these brunette parents. So it's also interesting that they are so blonde. The painting on the right is actually based off of a photo from the Ontario Jewish Archives. But similarly, in communities across North America that received large amounts of refugees, women like the ones pictured here got together, rolled up their sleeves, and did the work. They raised the funds needed to give scholarships to the refugees, to start clothing banks. They ran the clothing banks, and they had these beautiful, elaborate tea parties to raise the funds, do personal note letter writing campaigns, and so forth. So I look at these women with such a sentimental eye. So while they're both part of the same Jewish community, their worlds were obviously quite different, but meaningful all the same. Okay, let's go to the next one. Also, this one is interesting too. Family reunion at Valmorin in 1952. In the early 1950s, this is the story that goes with it. Just a few short years after my mom immigrated to Montreal, she and her family were often invited to the country homes of distant cousins who had arrived in Canada a generation before them. How awkward these reunions must have been. Well-intended relatives wanted to spark friendships amongst teenage cousins whose lives and experiences were so very different. The suffering of the Holocaust hovered over these gatherings, but nobody wanted to talk about it. The newcomers tried their best to fit in with the Canadians, but I suspect it never really felt natural for anyone. there's nothing truthful necessarily in this picture that my mom felt awkward with any of these cousins. It was just somehow the expressions on everybody's faces suggested it to me. But I did do some research, and yes, it was an unusual thing for Canadian-born teenagers to try and find something in common with teenagers born to a Holocaust experience. And I just thought this image so beautifully captured that. All right. And speaking of family reunions, I'm going to read the story that goes with this painting. And here's how it went down. And I will summarize by saying, oi. This painting is called Usher Had High Hopes, and it's based off of a photo that was taken in 1970. Usher was my father's uncle. He never married or had children. In 1949, after surviving the Holocaust, Usher arrived in Canada with my grandfather, my dad, and my Aunt Sylvia. The four of them were sponsored and taken in by their brother Avrum, who had moved to Montreal in 1929. Avrum was fortunate. He was safe in Canada when the Nazis came to power, and he became financially well off by opening a dress factory. When the three siblings reunited, it was awkward, to say the least. Two brothers suffered greatly during the Holocaust, while the other was comfortable enough to buy a new Pontiac. Usher felt personally insulted when my dad, only 16 years old, was handed a broom on his first day in Canada and told to sweep the floors of the dress factory. Actually, Usher was livid, and it marked the beginning of a lifetime of broigus, which is Yiddish for holding a grudge, with that side of the family. In my father's memoir, he describes that moment. Quote, "This outburst of indignation at his brother was like an opening scene in a play by Tennessee Williams. Usher must have figured out that there was not going to be manna falling from the sky, and sweeping his brother's floors was the proverbial last straw that shattered his dream of how it would be. The next day, we moved into a nice second-story flat on Jean-Man Street at the northwest corner of St. Viator. One can only imagine the pride Usher must have felt on the day my father graduated from law school. Usher died in 1972. He had terrible scars on his body from the time when the Ukrainian police, at the direction of the Nazis, beat him with a bicycle chain." This next painting is called Kott Textiles. And I wanted to highlight this one because I wanted to talk about the timing of one's arrival in Canada and what it meant depending on how old you were when you emigrated. So this painting was based off of a photo from 1969. And for the record, the baby is me. Okay, here's the story. My grandfather was the hero of my dad's family during the Holocaust. In 1949, after ensuring their survival, Zadie brought his family to Canada at the age of 50, where he quickly grew to understand that his best years were probably behind him, and real opportunity was reserved for the next generation. Nevertheless, hard work was expected, and Zadie and his brother Usher got into the schmata business, the fabric business. They opened Kott Textiles on Queen Street. It never took off. Jewish success stories are often peppered with tales of schmata peddlers who turn their small operations into some of the biggest names in fashion today, but this was not in the cards for Zadie and Usher. I grew up visiting that store on weekends with my parents and sisters. I remember Zadie reading the Yiddish Vorwärts, the forward, and always having a brown paper bag full of chocolate bars from the corner store for the Kinderlach. Zadie did not speak English well, but I do remember the sense of importance I felt when he'd test the quality of fabric of my clothes by rubbing a swatch between his fingers and then give a nod of approval. The store smelled like pine sol, reams of material, and cigarette smoke. I was certain that if he just had some good and colorful signage, which I'd hand draw, sales would go up. So this is a painting I wanted to share this one because I talked about how old refugees were and what opportunity meant for them as they arrived in Canada. What you see here is my father in the front row of Cheder in the DP camp in 1948 before they arrived in Canada. My dad told me at 15, this was his first real experience with education. In his memoir, he explains that in all, he had 2 years of formal education in his youth. He had completed the equivalent of first grade before the war, during which time he and his family fled to the forest to hide for 19 months. And when the war ended, they were in Russia. My dad had to work to help the family stay afloat. It was only when his family arrived in the DP camp in Poland that he finally had 1 year of education. My dad was 16 when he finished 7th grade in 1949. The war and the post-war years in Europe had robbed him of his entire youth. He never had a bar mitzvah, nor did he receive an education. This painting is based off of a photo that I used to study as a child. When I was growing up, I had some understanding of the Holocaust, but I couldn't figure out why all those kids looked so old. There's my father in the front row. He was so eager to learn, and he told me that he loved that 1 year he had in school. Remember my report cards, the ones where my teacher said that I talked too much? I think he would tell me this to inspire me to take my studies more seriously. As I painted these faces of these 14 and 15-year-olds, I couldn't help but compare them to my own child, who is 15 today. These children have struck me as so haunted and profoundly exhausted. I wondered what they had witnessed and who they had lost. Who looked after them? Did they rebuild? And how did life turn out for these children? When my dad graduated law school and was called to the bar in 1960, one of the senior lawyers at the firm where he articled remarked, "It's a long way from the forests of Poland to the halls of Osgoode Hall Law School." So in my father's memoir, he recounts the challenging path that he got himself on shortly after he arrived in Montreal at the age of 16. He was so determined to go from being a refugee to being, as he described it, a somebody, and get a degree. After almost an entire lifetime without a formal education, there were a few key players in the background who showed immeasurable kindness and sacrifice for him to reach his near impossible goals. So what I'd like to do is direct you to the painting on the right called "Nobody Asked Auntie Sylvia." This is a newer painting, and I wanted to show it because I always wondered if my dad's sister Sylvia resented the fact that after the Holocaust, her life was dictated by practicality and old-fashioned sexism. I don't imagine Zadie and Usher were reading the early writings of Betty Friedan in those days. Nobody asked Auntie Sylvia if she would enjoy or benefit from a higher education. When she moved to Canada as a teenager, Sylvia was relegated to the kitchen to cook and clean for the men of the house, while the educational opportunities were heaped onto my father. It wasn't fair, and I know my father felt really guilty about this, and we all had nothing but gratitude for Auntie Sylvia's sacrifices to help my dad achieve his goals. Her role wasn't lost on me either. My sisters and I all benefited from Auntie Sylvia's efforts. Sylvia passed away last March at the age of 89. I hope I asked her all the questions I wanted to ask. So now I'm going to direct you to the painting on the left. And I want to emphasize that this image of my father's graduation from university was taken only 8 short years after that year of cheder at the DP camp. Here's the story that goes with this painting, which is called "A Victory for Bernie, Sylvia, Zadie, Usher, and Meryl." And it was based off of a photo that was taken in 1956. When my family immigrated to Canada in 1949 after the Holocaust, there were so many obstacles to overcome. Every success was monumental. What could be better than passing the high school matriculation exams and then getting a degree and attending law school after virtually missing a lifetime of education during the war years and time spent in the DP camps? When my dad graduated from Sir George William University, now Concordia University, it wasn't just for him. There were so many people who were invested in this achievement, especially those who hid in the forest with him for 19 months during the war. But the person who really deserves a special mention was a teacher named Miss Mitchell. Shortly after my dad immigrated to Canada and was learning to speak English, he happened upon a tutor who was working with a boy who lived in his flat. Miss Mitchell wasn't wanting to take on any more students, but she saw something special in my dad and decided to help him get ready to take the grade 11 matriculation exams. Realizing that he was a refugee and that funds were tight, she refused to take her full pay. Here's how my father honored Miss Mitchell in his memoir. Quote, "In late summer 1953, I learned Miss Mitchell was not well and that she couldn't continue tutoring and guiding me anymore. I soon wrote some 7 or 8 exams and passed. I was admitted to Sir George William University and I personally wanted to tell Miss Mitchell. I found out that she was now at the Royal Victoria Hospital. When I came there, her brother told me that she was dying of cancer and that the diagnosis was the reason for her relatively early retirement. I was allowed to see her. She was alert and I told her the good news. I gave her my hand and she squeezed it hard. She died a week later. Amazing how she did not let on all those months that she tutored me. The vehicle of this lady's generosity carried me through the roughest terrain on my journey to where I wanted to go. So I wanted to show this painting because it will give you a sense of how very different my mother's and father's families were with respect to the task of rebuilding a new life in Canada. Zadie and Usher regarded my mother as the right girl at the wrong time, and this is how it unfolded. This painting is called My Parents' Chuppah. Here's the story. I was lucky to grow up in a home with parents who were completely in love with each other. Their romance was the stuff of fairy tales. Sort of. Two young survivors of the Holocaust, my parents met in Montreal. When my father was accepted to law school, they decided to get married, and the plan was simple. They'd move to Toronto, and my mother would work as a legal secretary to support my father as he completed his education. My mother's side of the family saw this as a hopeful and wonderful new chapter. The Holocaust and all the obstacles of adjusting to a new life in Canada were firmly behind them, and they could look forward to a bright future. My father's side of the family saw this marriage as the end of hope. They were furious, so much so that Zadie and Usher refused to attend their wedding. Zadie and Usher put all their hopes on my father's achievements. All the suffering during the Holocaust and the financial troubles they had in Canada would be worth it only if my dad became a success and graduated law school. They were certain that my mother would get pregnant immediately and my dad would drop out of school and shatter their dreams for his future. Added to this anger was the audacity of their son getting married before his older sister, my Aunt Sylvia. Such was the mindset of my grandfather and his brother. Somewhere in that stubbornness were good intentions. My father was undeterred. He enlisted one of the seamstresses at the garment factory where he worked to copy a Dior gown for my mom. He rented a tuxedo and my parents had a humble wedding at my great Aunt Scylla's living room. 5 days later, they were hunting for apartments in Toronto just as classes were starting at Osgoode Hall Law School. My parents made peace with Zadie and Usher. Their first priority was to find a husband for Sylvia, which they did. My mom introduced her to a cousin. My mom was able to support my dad throughout his education. He graduated 4 years later without missing a beat. Both Usher and Zadie loved my mother. She cared for each of them in their final months when they came to live with us before they passed away. So I'd like to note that Aunt Scylla was Lily Azoulay Schwartz's mom, and she's the lady in the green, and that was her apartment, her home actually on Hutchinson Street. Okay, so I now want to share these two paintings and focus on my great-grandparents. You have Chaya Leah on the right and Godel Mangel on the left. They were not married to each other, rather they were Mahatunim, in-laws. These two people's stories were almost lost forever because nobody wanted to talk about them. And I think I understand why. Immediately after they were murdered, Godel and Chaya Leah's surviving family members had to compartmentalize these horrors and go into survival mode in order to get through the war, save their children and each other. If they didn't, my grandparents would have completely fallen apart and then they all would have perished. But even in Canada, I believe my grandparents needed to stay partially in survival mode in order to keep moving forward with their lives. Telling their parents' stories would cause them to relive the horror all over again. When my sisters and I were born, my parents thought it was too scary to share their fates with us. They wanted to protect us so we didn't have nightmares. In the end, my great-grandparents were treated as if they didn't exist. But I wanted to know who they were and what happened to them. And my mom finally told me. So I'm going to direct you to the painting on the left, which is called A Dignified Background. And here's the story that goes with this painting. The first time I learned about my great-grandfather, Godel Mangel, was in middle school. We had to create a family tree and present an heirloom for a special class project. My family tree was sparse. It included all the names of my grandparents, but only a couple of names from my great-grandparents' generation and nothing else. My parents were children during the Holocaust and knew very little about our past. I asked about Godel, one of the few names on the exotic great-grandparent line. My mother told me that he was taken by the Nazis, but provided no other details. I then asked if we had any family heirlooms, and the answer was no. Everything we had was acquired after the family immigrated to Canada in 1949. At that time, our stuff was around 30 years old, so nothing passed from generation to generation. For a history lover like me, I felt deflated. When it was time to present our trees and heirlooms at school, I worried that my teacher would think that I didn't put any effort into the assignment. I recall a boy in my class, Teddy, proudly wearing his great-grandfather's First Nations headdress. His family had been on the land for thousands of years. I was jealous of Teddy. He had a proud history that he could trace. How ironic. As Teddy spoke, I saw how much the Holocaust had robbed my family. Our names, our records, and our possessions were obliterated. Fast forward to today. Thousands of documents are being uploaded almost daily on websites dedicated to preserving precious details about who existed when the Shoah started. I searched Godel Mengel. Imagine my surprise when a photo from a Krakow ghetto identity card uploaded onto my monitor. My handsome great-grandfather, looking humiliated, resigned, terrified, brave, and dignified, all in the same moment, was staring at me. He was 66 years old. My mom recognized him immediately, even though she was 5 years old the last time she saw him alive. She finally shared what happened to Godel. His was one of our family's unspeakable stories. Grandfather Godel was taken to one of the camps and was the victim of the Shoah's most sinister of crimes. I heard my mother's words like sound bites. They used him for science experiments, and they injected him with gasoline. It's no wonder she didn't share details about him when I was in middle school. I can barely put words to it now. I suddenly realized that he has no grave and that his story was so close to being relegated to the dustbins of history. I could almost feel his soul lingering in the heavens with no peace. I decided to provide great-grandfather Godel with a small monument to honor his life. As best I could, I created this painting out of a photo that was taken in an act of hatred. My studio took on a sacred quality. I was able to reach across time and space and recreate an image of my great-grandfather's face, but this time with love. Every brushstroke felt important. A powerful moment happened when the music on my iPhone looped to the Leonard Cohen song, You Want It Darker. Just as I felt I had captured Godel's likeness, I heard the haunting words of the Shaar Hashomayim men's choir singing, Hineni, which means here I am. My eyes filled with tears. The background pattern is from my dining room wallpaper, the room where Godel's great-great-grandchildren come together every week to celebrate Shabbat and continue living our Jewish heritage, the real heirloom that has been passed down from generation to generation. May you find abundant peace from heaven, dear great-grandfather Godel. So I'm almost done. I'm going to show you just 2 more slides. What you see here on the left is the Simcha. This is a wedding that happened at a synagogue in Montreal, maybe the Shaar, maybe not, I'm not sure. But what you have here are all of Godel and Chaya Leah's descendants, alive and well in Montreal, celebrating a good occasion in their pink and purple dresses. I painted this painting of the Simcha during the beginning of quarantine and the 2020 COVID crisis. And I found it really reassuring to look at all of these people who had been through so much and came to the other side of it. And it reassured me that this too will pass, that we will all come together again to celebrate a good occasion. And on the painting on the right, again, speaks to new beginnings and victory of life in Montreal, of a family that could come together after having suffered so much to celebrate a Jewish occasion and to see a Canadian grandchild read the 4 questions. And in my last presentation, I did point out the mismatched dishes, which speaks to the earlier story of not having any anything passed down from generation to generation, and no special items that have been in a family, dishes that were basically cobbled together because of the refugee experience. But the important message here is that family is together and celebrating their Judaism and the freedom of Canada. And so on that note, I'm going to share with you my last painting and story. This painting is literally still drying. And I thought it was a really good one that I wanted to make specifically for this presentation, because it's been in the back of my mind to paint this one, but I was motivated to finish it in time for today. And it's called Ice Cream Dreams at Saint-Faustin. And here's the story that goes with this painting, which is based off of a photo from approximately 1953. My parents, grandparents, and extended family immigrated to Montreal after the Holocaust and rebuilt their lives with nothing but gratitude for the city, its Jewish community, and Canada, the country that took them in and enabled them to start over, live in peace and security, and to build a new life characterized by possibility and prosperity for themselves and generations after them, including myself and my children. This painting is inspired by a photo from the early 1950s. My mom, still embarrassed that she was photographed wearing curlers in public, is with her brother and parents on vacation in the country, as they call it in Quebec. After the horrors they had escaped only a few years earlier, I love how relaxed they all look, doing something so ordinary like getting ice cream at the corner store. The symbolism of the Coca-Cola signage was not lost on me as I worked on this, as Coke is a brand that I associate with freedom. I truly appreciate how my family has lived in two countries, both Canada and the United States, where we are all guaranteed the right to either engage or not engage with our respective religions. All right, friends, that is the end of my presentation, formal presentation.
Oh my God. Oh my God, that was amazing. Amazing, truly amazing. And it was amazing because I have a whole page of things I've written down. First of all, there is just no way you could have done this without talking about the Holocaust. It's absolutely who you are and how you've been shaped, and it's so, so important. And that the whole story of your great-grandfather gave me the chills. Like, how beautiful is that? And it's such I love the wallpaper in the back and how you've brought in, you know, the generations. It's so, so beautiful. And I love how you've given a whole new perspective on what Judaic art is. It's not all menorahs and rabbis, right? It's all about who we are, where we come from, and our background and our history. And, you know, I always find it amazing when you look at art and we don't know the story behind it. We just look and go, oh, lovely picture, or I see this, or I see that. But it gives such a different perspective when you understand the story behind it. And my husband had this picture done years ago, and we met the artist recently, and I hated the picture, always hated it. But it wasn't until I spoke to the artist and understood where his mind was at the time where he painted it, that it gave me a whole different perspective. And now I love it. So listening to all the stories behind, and I know it couldn't have been easy for your family to come, but there's no sadness in any of those paintings that you painted. Like, even though they went through so much, and it was, and to start over again, and your dad, I mean, to what he accomplished and became a lawyer, like, it's phenomenal. There's nothing that's sadness or dark about your paintings. It's so uplifting and inspiring, and oh, I just love it. And I love the last one because I love old signs. So it's just such a great painting, that one. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. I thought it was fabulous.
Well, thank you. You're an excellent student of the Growing Up Jewish series, I must say. But I, you know, our pictures really tell us our history, because when you think about why would you take a picture? I mean, now you can take 40,000 pictures a day if you feel like it. But in those days, when film, you had to pay for your film. Your pictures basically give a strong signal about what you value. And so if it meant enough to take a picture of it must mean something. So it's interesting living here in the United States. Part of what got me started on this whole series was the 2013 Pew study. I was so concerned about what was trending before my eyes in terms of Jewish life. And I wanted to just look at Jewish life as experienced by someone who's basically secular, like not an Orthodox Jewish perspective, but from a secular Jewish perspective. And what was incredible was that so many people here in the United States, where I was so worried, immediately plugged into these stories, immediately saw their grandparents, immediately could smell the brisket, the same chicken soup, the same sounds at Seder. So that was probably one of the most incredible things, is that people saw themselves in these paintings because their photo albums look like this too.
Yeah, exactly. And there's something comforting about that. And there's something nostalgic about that people relate to. And I just think it's, I think they're fabulous. I mean, it's going to be on my list to one day buy one of your paintings for sure.
Well, I'm hoping to bring it to Montreal. That would be, obviously we're waiting for this. I thought we were done with COVID, but I guess we're not.
Well,
but I can see the end. Regardless, I do. I'm working with a team in Toronto to bring it to Toronto, and then once it's in Canada, I really do hope to drive it into Montreal and find a suitable venue to show the work, because it was like a love note to Toronto and Montreal, really. Honestly, like coming to this community means so much to me. So
was it therapeutic in a way for you doing this series?
I didn't even know I needed therapy, but yes. It was incredible. And what's so nice too is, my mom, especially during COVID, she was isolated and she's at home. We've got families, but to be able to call her and ask her about all the photos and talk to her about it and get her stories and get her to tell me about everything, her philosophy on Judaism, what my grandmother's philosophy was, how it was observed in the old country, what they brought with them. It was just amazing to go through these old photos and be able to identify all the players in them and share the stories. So that was an incredible experience. I recommend it, and on your iPhone, you can actually put notes beside your pictures now to say who's who. Oh, so that's kind of a cool thing that you can do on your phones. And people will appreciate it when, they see it and they go, oh, that was, Aunt Myrtle in the Catskills.
Okay, so we just had a note here from Mom Rap, and she said, hi, Jacqueline, I just made a wonderful connection. Lillian and Ronnie Mangle are very close friends of ours, and I just realized that they must be your aunt and uncle.
Yes,
I would love for them
to I think they're on this call.
So this will be recorded. It is recorded, Mom, so you'll be able to send it to them. Just just check in.
Lily and Ronnie are on this call right now, so at least
there you go.
Yes, so I think they're here anyhow. But yes, this is like a family reunion tonight.
Yeah, I feel like I'm part of the family.
You are. Everybody's a part of the family now.
Okay, well, that's it. I don't think we have any questions. I think I think that was just fabulous, and I just loved the paintings and I love the way you paint too. I think because art's subjective, right? But I really, and it's funny how you were saying how things come full circle. They really do. So anyway, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. It's been so lovely getting to know you and through your paintings and your family, and I look forward to what your next exhibition is going to be.
Me too.
Yeah, I look forward to that, and thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And that's it from us. So good night, everybody. And thank you
all
so
the
much
best
for joining us. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.